In the autumn of 1943, as RAF Lancaster bombers reduced Berlin's eastern districts to smoldering rubble and the Red Army pressed westward across the Ukrainian steppes, the machinery of German military intelligence began to consume itself. The Abwehr, Wehrmacht intelligence under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, had grown increasingly suspect in the eyes of Heinrich Himmler's SS apparatus. Rivalries between intelligence services, always bitter in the Third Reich, had metastasized into something more dangerous. A silent civil war fought in coded transmissions, interrogation cells, and the ash-strewn streets of the capital. It was during this period of institutional paranoia that Hauptmann Ernst Bergmann, a mid-level Abwehr signals officer stationed at the Tirpitz-Ziffer headquarters, disappeared from official German records. His personnel file was transferred to Gestapo custody on November 14, 1943, following his capture in a compromised safe house in the Charlottenburg district. What followed was not the standard trajectory of an arrested intelligence officer: execution, imprisonment, or show trial, but something far more complex and ultimately more destructive to German counterintelligence operations in Berlin. Bergmann became a double agent, not by choice, but by the peculiar arithmetic of survival that governed occupied Europe in the war's final years. The capture. The safe house at Kantstrasse 147 had served the Abwehr's Section 3F, responsible for counterintelligence operations in occupied territories since early 1942. It was unremarkable in every way. A four-story residential building with a tailor shop on the ground floor, indistinguishable from the hundreds of similar structures that lined Berlin's western avenues. The apartment on the third floor, leased under a commercial cover identity, contained a powerful wireless transmitter concealed inside a wardrobe modified by Abwehr technicians, a small library of one-time cipher pads, and a rotating staff of signals officers who maintained contact with field agents across occupied France and the Low Countries. Ernst Bergmann had worked from this location twice weekly since his transfer from the Zossen Communications Center south of Berlin. His responsibilities were administrative rather than operational, encoding and decoding agent reports using the Abwehr's modified Enigma variant, maintaining transmission schedules, and coordinating with courier networks that moved physical intelligence materials through neutral Sweden and Switzerland. He was 34 years old, a career signals officer who had served in Wehrmacht communications units since 1936, transferred to the Abwehr in 1940 due to his fluency in French and demonstrated competence with encryption systems. The raid occurred at 2:47 a.m. on November 14th. 6 plainclothes Gestapo officers from Section 4E, responsible for counterintelligence within Germany itself, entered the building using keys obtained from the building superintendent, who had been under surveillance for 3 weeks. They had not coordinated with Abwehr leadership. The operation was conducted under the authority of SS Sturmbannführer Horst Kopkow, whose Section 4 E2 specialized in detecting and eliminating underground resistance networks and had grown increasingly aggressive in investigating the Abwehr's loyalty to the regime. Bergmann was alone in the apartment, completing the decryption of an agent report from Brussels. The Gestapo found him with his Enigma machine disassembled for maintenance, cipher materials spread across a table, and a partially completed message log that documented 3 months of communications with agents the Gestapo had secretly arrested weeks earlier. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. Proof that Abwehr agents in occupied Belgium had been compromised without the Tirpitz-Ziffer headquarters detecting the breach. He was transported to the Gestapo headquarters on Prinz-Albrechtstrasse before dawn, processed through the administrative machinery of political arrest, and placed in a holding cell in the basement complex that had, by late 1943, become synonymous with the systematic torture of political prisoners and suspected resistance members. The proposition: what Bergmann could not have known during his first 72 hours of detention was that his arrest had been observed by British intelligence. The safe house had been under surveillance not by the Gestapo alone, but by a small network of Allied intelligence assets embedded within Berlin's civilian infrastructure: railway workers, postal employees, municipal clerks, who fed information to British Secret Intelligence Service handlers through a complex chain of couriers that extended through Denmark and Sweden. The British had identified Bergman 6 months earlier as a potential recruitment target. His profile suggested vulnerability. Politically unaligned, professionally competent, but not ideologically committed, with no party membership beyond the obligatory pro forma affiliations required of Wehrmacht officers. His wife had died in the November 1943 RAF bombing of the Tiergarten district. He had no children. The social isolation and professional disillusionment that followed made him, in the cold assessment of MI6 Berlin station, a viable candidate for manipulation. The Gestapo interrogation followed predictable patterns. Bergman was questioned about his knowledge of compromised agents, about potential Abwehr officers who might harbor anti-regime sympathies, about the extent of Admiral Canaris's knowledge of field operations in Western Europe. He was not physically tortured. His value as a technical specialist protected him from the cruder methods applied to political prisoners, but he was subjected to sleep deprivation, isolation, and the psychological pressure of repeatedly transcribing his own statements while interrogators looked for inconsistencies. On the 8th day of his detention, he received an unexpected visitor. Criminal rat Friedrich Panzinger, deputy chief of Gestapo Section 4, A1, responsible for communist resistance networks, entered his cell accompanied by an aide. Panzinger was known within German counterintelligence circles as a pragmatist who prioritized operational results over ideological purity. The conversation that followed was brief and conducted in the flat, administrative tone of a business transaction. The proposition was simple. Bergman would be released to limited supervision and would resume transmitting intelligence reports through Abwehr channels. However, the content of these transmissions would be controlled by the Gestapo. He would become a conduit for disinformation designed to identify and eliminate remaining Abwehr networks that the SS suspected of disloyalty to the regime. His alternative was transfer to a concentration camp pending trial for suspected treason. Bergman accepted. He had no realistic option to refuse. The double game begins. What neither the Gestapo nor Bergman initially understood was that British intelligence had anticipated this exact scenario. The Allied intelligence services operating against Germany in 1943-44 had developed sophisticated methods for detecting and manipulating double agents, refined through years of running the double-cross system in Britain, which had successfully turned every German agent operating on British soil. The same principles, careful observation, pattern analysis, and the creation of plausible deception narratives, could be applied in reverse. Through their network of assets within Berlin's administrative infrastructure, British intelligence learned of Bergman's release within 48 hours. A municipal clerk in the Gestapo's administrative office, who had been passing information to Allied intelligence since 1941, photographed Bergman's release documentation during a routine filing operation. The documents revealed his new status: released under supervision, required to report to Gestapo handlers twice weekly, assigned to continue signals work under control conditions. The British assessment was immediate and opportunistic. Bergman had been compromised by the Gestapo and was now likely being used as a control channel for German counterintelligence. But this situation presented an opportunity rather than a threat. If contact could be established with Bergman, if his cooperation could be secured through coercion or persuasion, he could become a triple agent, ostensibly working for the Gestapo while actually feeding them false intelligence crafted by Allied deception specialists. The approach was made through a courier network that operated out of the Anhalter Bahnhof, Berlin's southern railway terminus. A railway postal worker, a middle-aged woman named Frieda Scholz, who had been passing information to Allied intelligence since her husband's death at Stalingrad, made contact with Bergman in late November 1943 during his supervised return to modified duties at a Gestapo-controlled signals facility in the Dahlem district. The message was delivered as a coded note tucked inside a newspaper left on a bench in the station's main waiting hall. It contained two critical pieces of information. First, that Allied intelligence knew of his situation and his compromise by the Gestapo. Second, that they could offer him a form of protection. Not escape, but rather the ability to conduct his forced cooperation with the Gestapo in a way that would ultimately undermine German intelligence operations while preserving his life. The logic was cruel, but effective. Bergman was trapped between two intelligence services. But if he cooperated with the British while appearing to cooperate with the Gestapo, he might survive. The British note included a simple instruction. During his next transmission session, he should introduce a specific pattern of encryption errors into his messages. Errors that would be invisible to his Gestapo supervisors, but recognizable to Allied cryptanalysts monitoring German signals traffic. Bergman complied. He had, by this point, abandoned any pretense of patriotic loyalty to either side. His motivation was survival, nothing more. The mechanics of deception. The operation that followed, codenamed Bergman, in British intelligence files, though Bergman himself never knew this designation, became one of the most complex deception operations conducted against German intelligence inside the Reich itself. It required precise coordination between multiple Allied intelligence services, careful management of the information fed to Bergman, and constant monitoring of Gestapo reactions to ensure the deception remained undetected. The technical aspects were formidable. Bergman's Gestapo handlers had provided him with modified Enigma encryption equipment and a set of codebooks that were supposed to be used for all his transmissions. However, the British had long since broken the standard Wehrmacht Enigma variants, and their government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park could decrypt his messages within hours of transmission. What the Gestapo didn't know was that Bergman had been instructed to introduce subtle modifications to his encryption procedures. Minor variations in rotor settings, deliberate transposition errors in certain message preambles that served as signals to Allied cryptanalysts that the messages were being sent under duress and that their content should be assumed to be Gestapo-controlled disinformation. The content of Bergman's transmissions was carefully crafted. The Gestapo believed they were using him to send false intelligence reports that would identify remaining Abwehr networks and flush out agents suspected of disloyalty. But the British fed Bergman counter-disinformation, false information about false information, designed to waste German counterintelligence resources and protect genuine Allied networks operating inside Berlin. For example, in January 1944, Bergman transmitted a message ostensibly from a compromised Abwehr agent in Paris, reporting on the location of a supposed Allied intelligence cell operating in the 16th arrondissement. The Gestapo, believing this was genuine intelligence from their controlled asset, dispatched resources to investigate. But the address was a location the British had specifically chosen as a decoy, a building that had already been abandoned by its residents and was known to be under Gestapo surveillance. The operation consumed German counterintelligence resources, generated false confidence in Bergman as a reliable asset, and provided no genuine intelligence about Allied operations. The system worked because it exploited the fundamental problem of intelligence services operating in hostile environments: the difficulty of verifying information when normal methods of confirmation are unavailable. The Gestapo couldn't easily verify Bergman's transmissions without exposing their own surveillance of him. The British couldn't directly communicate with Bergman without risking his exposure. All parties operated in a fog of uncertainty, making decisions based on incomplete information and institutional paranoia. The pressure of dual betrayal. By spring 1944, Bergman had been operating as an unwitting triple agent for nearly 6 months. The psychological toll was severe. He lived in a state of constant fear. Fear of exposure by the Gestapo, fear of being identified by British intelligence as unreliable, fear of making a mistake in his encryption procedures that would reveal his situation to either side. His daily routine had become a study in practice deception. Twice weekly, he reported to Gestapo headquarters on Prinz Albrechtstrasse for supervision meetings with his handlers. These sessions involved reviewing his transmission logs, discussing the content of messages he had sent, and receiving instructions for future communications. The Gestapo handlers, satisfied with what they believed was his complete cooperation, had gradually reduced their direct supervision. They believed they had broken him completely during his initial detention and that he now operated out of simple fear and self-preservation. They were correct about his motivations, but wrong about his loyalty. On the days when he wasn't reporting to the Gestapo, Bergman worked from a small apartment in the Wilmersdorf district that served as a controlled signals facility. The apartment contained a standard Wehrmacht Enigma machine, a small library of technical manuals, and a wireless transmitter that could reach receiving stations as far as occupied France. He was permitted minimal contact with other personnel. His isolation was part of the Gestapo's control strategy, and his movements outside the apartment were monitored by plainclothes surveillance teams. His contact with Allied intelligence continued through the courier network. Messages were passed through a series of intermediaries: railway workers, postal employees, black market traders who moved through Berlin's bombed-out districts collecting salvage, none of whom knew the full extent of the operation. The British used a system of one-time cipher pads for their instructions to Bergman, delivered as seemingly innocuous classified advertisements in the Berliner Morgenpost newspaper. A notice advertising used furniture for sale at a specific address contained, when decoded using the proper cipher, instruction for the next phase of the deception operation. Bergman memorized his cipher pads and destroyed them immediately after use. The Allied instructions were precise, specific encryption errors to introduce into his next transmission, particular phrases to include in message preambles that would signal the artificial nature of the intelligence, subtle modifications to transmission timing that would alert Allied monitoring stations that the content was being sent under Gestapo control. The margin for error was non-existent. A single mistake, an encryption error that looked like genuine incompetence rather than deliberate signaling, a message that arrived at the wrong time, a phrase that aroused suspicion in his Gestapo handlers, could expose the entire operation. The RAF comes to Berlin. The Allied bombing campaign against Berlin intensified dramatically in the winter of 1943-44. The RAF's Battle of Berlin, involving 16 major raids between November 1943 and March 1944, killed an estimated 10,000 civilians and destroyed hundreds of thousands of buildings. The Americans joined with daylight precision bombing raids targeting industrial facilities. The city became a landscape of ruins, its streets choked with rubble, its population increasingly desperate as food supplies dwindled and public services collapsed. Bergman experienced the bombing firsthand. The Wilmersdorf apartment building where he operated suffered partial damage in a February 1944 raid. The blast collapsed the building's western wall, destroyed his wireless transmitter, and forced his temporary relocation to a backup facility in the Steglitz district. The Gestapo, rather than seeing this as an operational setback, viewed it as further confirmation of Bergman's genuine commitment to his work. No one would voluntarily remain in Berlin during this period unless compelled by duty or fear. The bombing also disrupted the courier networks that connected Bergman to Allied intelligence. Street addresses that had served as dead drops were obliterated overnight. Postal routes were reorganized as entire districts became impassable. The railway networks, already strained by military transport demands, became increasingly unreliable as tracks were damaged and stations destroyed. Yet the operation continued. The British adapted their communication methods, using emergency backup protocols that had been established for exactly this kind of disruption. Messages were transmitted through neutral Sweden via diplomatic courier when direct communication proved impossible. The courier network adapted, using the chaos of post-raid salvage operations as cover for intelligence collection. During this period, Bergman transmitted some of the most significant pieces of false intelligence in the entire operation. In March 1944, he sent a series of messages ostensibly from aware sources in England, reporting on the Allied preparations for cross-channel invasion. The information was carefully crafted by British deception specialists to reinforce German expectations that the invasion would target the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The Gestapo, believing this intelligence came from genuinely compromised Allied sources, passed it up the chain to OKW headquarters, where it contributed to the broader pattern of German miscalculation about Allied invasion plans. Bergman never knew the content of these messages had been deliberately shaped by Allied intelligence planners. He simply encoded what his British handlers provided through the courier network, transmitted it according to his Gestapo instructions, and hoped both sides remained convinced of his cooperation. The collapse. The operation began to deteriorate in the summer of 1944, following the successful Allied invasion of Normandy and the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler. The aftermath of the Valkyrie plot triggered a massive wave of arrests throughout German military and intelligence services. The Gestapo, paranoid and empowered by emergency security measures, launched investigations into anyone with even tangential connections to the military resistance. The Abwehr was dissolved entirely in February 1944, absorbed into the SS intelligence apparatus under Walter Schellenberg's SD. Personnel were screened, interrogated, and in many cases arrested. Admiral Canaris himself was eventually arrested and would be executed in April 1945. The entire institutional structure that had employed Bergman ceased to exist. Bergman's Gestapo handlers became increasingly suspicious, not of Bergman specifically, but of the entire intelligence environment. The successful Allied deception operations surrounding D-Day, including the extensive double-cross system, had begun to expose the extent to which German intelligence had been penetrated. Counterintelligence officers who had previously accepted agent reports at face value now questioned everything. Trust evaporated. In August 1944, Bergman was summoned to Prinz Albrechtstrasse for what he was told would be a routine supervision meeting. Instead, he was placed under detention pending a comprehensive review of his entire operational history. The Gestapo had not identified his specific role as a triple agent, but they had detected anomalies in the intelligence he had transmitted, not because they had broken his coded signals to the British, but because the overall pattern of information flowing through him had failed to produce the expected results. The courier network made one final attempt to extract him. A message was passed through the black market networks suggesting a possible escape route through the city's damaged sewer systems to a safe house near the Tempelhof field. But Bergman never received it. He was held in isolation, subjected to renewed interrogation, and eventually transferred to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in October 1944. The final accounting. The historical record of Ernst Bergman ends in fragmentary documentation. Gestapo files destroyed in the final days of the war make a complete accounting impossible. Witness testimony from Sachsenhausen survivors suggests that a signals officer matching Bergman's description was held in the camp's special prisoners section through the winter of 1944 to 45, but positive identification remains uncertain. What is documented is the impact of Operation Bergman on German intelligence operations in Berlin during the war's final year. Post-war analysis by British intelligence concluded that the operation successfully channeled false information to German counterintelligence, wasted significant German resources investigating phantom resistance networks, and contributed to the broader deception efforts surrounding D-Day and subsequent Allied operations. The Gestapo files that survived the wars contain no indication that they ever fully understood Bergman's role as a triple agent. His final interrogation reports, recovered from partially destroyed archives, suggest that the investigating officers suspected he had been careless or incompetent rather than deliberately deceptive. The bureaucratic language is telling. Unreliable source, insufficient verification of agent reports, recommended for permanent detention pending further investigation. The British files are only marginally more informative. After Bergman's detention in August 1944, MI6 Berlin station attempted to re-establish contact through the courier network, but received no response. A final assessment, dated November 1944, concluded that the asset had been lost to hostile action and that the operation should be considered terminated. No extraction attempt was authorized. The strategic value of maintaining the courier network for other operations outweighed the risk of attempting a rescue that would likely fail and might compromise other assets. The courier network itself survived until Berlin's fall in May 1945. Frieda Scholz, the railway postal worker who had initially contacted Bergman, continued to pass information to Allied intelligence until Soviet forces captured the Anhalter Bahnhof. Her ultimate fate is unrecorded in Western intelligence archives, lost in the chaos of Berlin's final days and the subsequent Soviet occupation. Epilogue: the shadows remain. Intelligence operations of this type rarely produce heroes in the conventional sense. The individuals involved, the signals officers, the couriers, the cryptanalysts, the handlers on both sides, operated in a moral twilight where loyalty was conditional, betrayal was measured in degrees, and survival often required compromising one's principles completely. Ernst Bergmann, if he was indeed the prisoner who died in Sachsenhausen in the spring of 1945, left no personal testimony about his experiences as a double agent. No diary, no letters, no post-war memoir. His motivations remained opaque even to those who ran him as an asset. He cooperated with Allied intelligence, not out of ideological conviction, but out of the simple, desperate calculus of self-preservation. He betrayed his country, his service, and ultimately perhaps himself, in exchange for a few additional months of life in a city that was systematically destroying itself. The British intelligence officers who managed Operation Bergmann from London received no recognition for their work. The operation remained classified for decades after the war, its details buried in archives that were only partially declassified in the 1970s and 1980s. Even then, the documentation was incomplete, fragmented by bureaucratic reorganization and the deliberate destruction of sensitive materials. What remains is a case study in the mechanics of deception and the psychology of coerced cooperation. In the final analysis, Operation Bergmann succeeded not because of brilliant tradecraft or heroic resistance, but because it exploited the fundamental weaknesses of intelligence organizations operating under conditions of institutional paranoia. The inability to verify information, the tendency to see what one expects to see, and the corrosive effect of fear on rational judgment. Berlin in 1945 was a city of shadows, its buildings reduced to hollow shells, its streets filled with refugees and survivors moving through ruins. The intelligence networks that had operated through those streets, the agents and couriers, the safe houses and dead drops, the encrypted transmissions and coded newspaper advertisements, vanished with the city's destruction. The individuals who had risked everything in that silent war disappeared into history, their names forgotten, their contributions unrecognized, their sacrifices unrecorded except in fragmentary archival materials that offer only glimpses of the complex human reality behind the operational summaries. Ernst Bergmann, if we can call him that with any certainty, was one of thousands who navigated the impossible moral terrain of occupied Europe in the war's final years. He was not a hero. He was not even, in the conventional sense, a traitor. He was simply a man trapped between two implacable forces, trying to survive in a world that had abandoned any pretense of mercy or moral clarity. The Berlin cell existed for less than a year. It fed false intelligence to the Gestapo, supported Allied deception operations, and then vanished into the historical record with barely a trace. Its success, such as it was, came at the cost of individual lives that history has chosen not to remember. This is their memorial, an accounting of methods and mechanisms, devoid of sentiment, accurate in its details, but incomplete in its humanity. It is all that remains of those who operated in the shadows, serving causes they may not have believed in, betraying loyalties they once held, and dying deaths that went largely unrecorded except in the cold, bureaucratic language of intelligence files that no one reads anymore. The city they fought over has been rebuilt. The archives that document their struggle remain only partially open. The truth of what they experienced, the moral compromises they made, the fear they lived with daily, exists now only in fragments, pieces of a larger story that can never be fully reconstructed because too much has been lost to time, destruction, and the institutional secrecy that governed their world. This is what remains, not heroes or villains, but human beings making impossible choices in impossible circumstances, their legacy preserved only in the bloodless technical language of operational after-action reports and declassified file summaries that reduce human tragedy to bureaucratic notation. The shadows are all that remain.